Welcome to What's Next from AgResearch, a podcast exploring science answers to big questions. I'm Erin. I work at AgResearch, a Crown Research Institute responsible for delivering innovative science and research outcomes specifically for the agriculture sector. I work at AgResearch, but I'm not a scientist. I do have lots of questions about our science, though, and I thought that you might too. In this episode, I'm asking, can we do something about methane without ruining farming? Before we get too far into things, it's important to note that AgResearch doesn't have climate scientists as such, the people who study what happens to greenhouse gases when they get into the atmosphere. Instead, we focus on studying the processes that generate those gas emissions from livestock and livestock farming systems and how we can influence these. We accept, and 97% of actively publishing climate scientists agree, that there's overwhelming scientific evidence globally of climate change caused by human activity. In New Zealand, we typically defer to expert climate scientists like Professor David Frame, who's spoken at length about the evidence of human-induced climate change alongside our friends at other CRIs like NIWA. While AgResearch doesn't have climate scientists, what we do have are scientists with expertise in areas that can help. Geneticists, modelers, plant breeders, and soil and water scientists. They're working on the plants and animals of the future, working on how pastoral agriculture will survive and even thrive in a warmer climate with drier conditions. So what we know about methane is that when compared to other greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide, is that while it's short-lived in the atmosphere, it hangs around for about 12 years, its warming effects are significantly stronger, and that's why it's a bit of a worry here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we've established that methane's a problem, right? And even if you don't want to believe that, it's worth noting that our main customers for the things New Zealand produces do, and they want to make sure that we're doing what we can, and maybe even a little bit more, to mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions. Enter Dr. Suzanne Rowe, a geneticist and AgResearch principal scientist based at Invermay near Dunedin. Suzanne, hi.
Hi, Erin.
Let's start by clearing something up, and I think you might roll your eyes, but just to make sure, does the methane come from the back end of the animal or?
90% of the methane comes from the front end of the animal. So as the animal digests feed in the gut, the gas is produced as a waste and it's beautifully, elegantly dispelled out of the front end.
So burps are the problem.
Burps are the problem.
Right. So now we've got that out of the way. Can you reduce methane emissions from livestock?
We absolutely can. It's really clear that livestock have individual differences and actually different animals emit different amounts of methane depending on how they digest feed.
So that's a bit of a relief, considering what I've just said about methane being quite problematic. How does it all work?
It's hugely exciting. So an animal harbours microbes in their gut and they help them to break down all of the grasses that they can't digest. And it seems that our livestock have the ability to control the mix of bugs in their stomach, and some just harbour a different mixture of bugs, and that mixture of bugs produces a different amount of hydrogen gas and a different amount of methane. So there are natural low emitters.
And so if I'm a ewe and I'm a natural low emitter, will my lambs be the same?
They absolutely will. It looks as though it's moderately heritable, as heritable as most of the other protection traits that we breed for. So we can select the next generation to be a lower emitters than this one.
And you've been working on this for a while, right?
We've been working on this for many generations. At AgResearch, we have our own research flocks and farms, and it's really important to us that we put the hard work in early. So we put the research in to make sure that we are ahead of the farming nation and we are generations ahead so that we see what's coming down the track and we understand what the implications are of any management practices or breeding tools that we recommend.
And so this isn't just a blip?
Absolutely not.
And so you've done this with sheep. Is it possible with other ruminants?
It very much is. LIC have a significant program together with CRV to lower methane in dairy cattle across New Zealand. And we're working really closely with beef and lamb to do the same in the beef sector.
And how much of a difference has it made so far? What do you think is possible?
We started off looking at just a few percent, but we've been measuring methane in our research flock now since 2017. And it's projected to lower methane by around 27% by 2050. So that's meeting the global targets that have been set to our government and that our government have set to us.
That's pretty substantial.
It's really quite astonishing.
And is it just the reduction in methane that you get? I guess if I'm a farmer, I might think, well, this is all well and good, Suzanne, but, I've got to reduce my methane, but am I going to end up losing out on this?
No, it's quite a fundamental change because you're changing the way feed is digested. You're actually changing the whole production system. And what we find is that the animals that emit less gas and less methane tend to grow a bit faster, have more lean yield. They have a little bit more wool, and they're just a bit leaner. So it's actually a healthy, profitable animal that we're seeing at the end of this.
So you're telling me I get a sheep that emits less methane and makes more meat?
Absolutely.
That sounds win-win to me.
That's how it feels.
So what's the one thing you wish everyone knew about this work?
I think one of the things that I say to people is that having travelled the length and breadth of the country, measuring animals right from, Southland right up to the tip of Northland, what we're seeing is that every single farm has low emitters and high emitters. So it's a relatively benign trait. It doesn't seem to have been selected for or against in the past. So that means that every farmer has the ability, if they understand how their sheep rank, to choose the low emitting ones.
Well, that's great news. And look, if there's one thing I know about scientists is that you're never really satisfied with one answer. There's always another question waiting in the wings. So what's next? What are you working on now?
I think one of the biggest challenges we have is measuring enough animals. Getting to everyone and measuring everyone's animals is quite tough. And what we've been looking at is, are there other ways to predict methane in young animals? And we've really focused on the stomach and the microbes that are in the stomach, because they're the crux of what's going on in the fermentation. And what we've developed is an oral swab that we can wipe. It's a dental swab, so very simple system that we can wipe around the animal's mouth, and we can actually from there extract the microbes. And when we understand the microbial mix, we can predict the amount of methane that animal's going to emit in the future.
That is amazing.
It's a very cool piece of science. We're very excited about it.
So just to go back, when you're talking about measuring methane, so if you haven't quite got the dental swab details worked out just yet, how do we measure methane at the moment?
We currently have chambers. So they're enclosed spaces. We have 12 of them on a trailer. We have 3 trailers, and we go up the farm gate, and we tend to measure lambs at around 10 months of age. Their rumens are nice and established, so we put them into these chambers for 45 minutes. We do it on farm. They come straight off pasture, so minimal disruption. We measure them for 45 minutes, and that's sufficient to give them a ranking then for the rest of their lives.
So 45 minutes in a little chamber, are they okay with that?
They seem to be absolutely fine. We sort of liken it to their own private space. They can see other animals, but they feel safe in there. And thus far, we've had absolutely no behavioural problems with it at all.
I overheard someone say that while methane is our biggest headache, we shouldn't take our eye off the ball on nitrous oxide. And what do we know about nitrous oxide? Well, it's 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. It survives in the atmosphere for about 114 years, and it also depletes the ozone layer, which we're so aware of it in New Zealand. So that's a pretty big deal. So it's a double threat, and that is a big problem. To find out more about nitrous oxide and what we could do about it, I found some time with Brent Barrett, who might have ended up in medicine if only he hadn't fainted at the sight of blood. But lucky for us, he chose science, and he's now a senior scientist in AgResearch's plant genetics team, where he's been busy working on improving our clover and ryegrass. Brent, hi.
Hi, Erin.
Let's start with your work on pasture. I guess it's fair to say that without great pasture, our agriculture sector would really struggle?
Absolutely. Pasture is a cornerstone of every farm system, and we know that great plant genetics leads to good outcomes in those farm systems. So ryegrass is just really, really good at turning water and sunshine into feed. And it's low cost, it's reliable. The estimate is that it's worth about $14 billion a year to the New Zealand economy. Tack on clover to another $3 billion, and it's making a huge contribution to New Zealand.
That is definitely significant. And with all of that in mind, you're working on a project called Biological Nitrification Inhibition, or BNI, a little bit easier to say. Tell me a wee bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I might just touch on nitrogen and kind of the role that it plays before diving into BNI. So nitrogen's really important for those plants to be able to grow. Traditionally, we've had a lot of use of clover to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and it hands it on to the ryegrass. It's a great outcome. And more recently, we've started to use a lot of additional nitrogen being added into farm systems because, frankly, it turbocharges pasture growth, and that's a really handy thing for farmers. So we understand why it's being used, but sometimes it can leak out of the system. And sometimes quite significantly. So that's where we get all those nitrous oxide emissions from. And that's where we get nitrates that kind of come into water. So we know that if we can stop that leaking, everyone's going to be better off. Like the farmer's going to be better off, the environment's going to be better off. So that's where this biological nitrification inhibition comes in, or BNI.
And so what exactly is it? It's a trait.
It is. So it's a way that plants actually engineer the environment around them. So plants are stuck. Like they can't just get up and walk somewhere. If they need a liter of milk, they can't just walk to the store. Like they have to make do with whatever comes by. So when a bit of nitrogen shows up, it's a good idea for the plant to try to grab it. So what's happened over time is that plants have evolved the abilities through their root chemistry to actually drop some of that chemistry into the soil around the roots. And it slows down that change that nitrogen goes through to be basically the good form that they can use. Through to the bad form that kind of leaks out into the environment. So the BNI is kind of it's a scientific term is what it is, frankly, but it's how the plants actually slow that process down, grab more of the nitrogen, and make more use of it.
So you've said good nitrogen, bad nitrogen. So good nitrogen is what we want. And I imagine as a farmer, that's what you want. That's what you're paying for if you're putting it on or you're planting clover for. So bad nitrogen, now it can go bad one of two ways, right?
Yeah. So it's nobody wants to pay money for nitrogen, go to the effort of adding it onto their pasture and then lose it. But literally that's what happens when nitrogen either goes into groundwater or when nitrogen goes in to the atmosphere as nitrous oxide. So that's kind of the bad end of it. And we know now that through BNI, we can actually tip that balance and actually get a bit more of the good, which is nitrogen that the plants can actually grab, use, and grow, and a bit less of the bad, which is that pollution that we're trying to cut down on. So
how do we capitalize? So what does the BNI do? Tell me more about how all of this works.
Yeah, sure. It's absolutely fascinating. So, plants are just hanging out there all the time. And what we now know is that some of those plants are predisposed to having incredibly good root chemistry that actually really slows down that nitrification process, that transition from kind of the good nitrogen forms to the bad nitrogen forms. And so we know that if we can find those plants that are much, much better at this job and get them all in a bag of seed and get it to the farmers, we're going to have much better outcomes in terms of nitrogen performance on farm, lower nitrous oxide emissions, and potentially increase pasture growth. So in some ways, it's that simple, which is kind of amazing. This trait has been found in a number of plant species. We've seen that it's present in some individuals of elite ryegrass. It's already available to New Zealand farmers. It's not in others. So we kind of need to find the ones that have it and push those forward into breeding programs. And the ones that don't have it, obviously, we can set them aside.
And so how long does that kind of process take? How far away is it before, say I was a farmer, how long before I could potentially grow this on my farm?
Yeah, so start your stopwatch, right? But we think actually within the next 5 years we can land this. And the reason is because we've actually looked inside some of those elite genetics, some of those cultivars that are already available to farmers. And we've seen that some of the plants actually already have that trait. So we're really excited about that. We thought it might be like a really long thing where we had to drag in some genetics from wild species and adapt them and do, big stuff. But we actually think we can land it in about 5 years, provided we get the investment to keep moving.
That's pretty quick for science, right?
Yeah, and especially plant breeding. Plant breeding is always a really long run thing. So we're really excited that it's, literally at our fingertips.
And how much impact do you think it could have?
Yeah, that's part of the study that we need to do and try to really testing this out in different environments, different soils, and proving it. But back of the envelope in terms of what we've calculated so far based on science that's been done in tropical pastures and science that's been done in some cropping systems like wheat. We estimate that we might be able to knock out about a third of the nitrous oxide emissions simply through deploying this trait through ryegrass in New Zealand. So that's millions of tons of nitrous oxide not being emitted into the atmosphere each year, which is a brilliant outcome.
That's pretty significant. And you said that there may also be a production increase. So it sounds like it could be win-win?
Yeah, we think there's that prospect, and more than think. So the science tells us when we look at what's been published, especially in cropping systems, that by slowing down that loss of nitrogen, you can actually get a bit more yield coming through your system. I mean, it makes sense. It's like first principles. If you don't lose the nitrogen and you use the nitrogen, you're bound to be better off. And that's actually what the science is showing so far. So we think we'll get a win in terms of a bit more productivity for amount of nitrogen that's put into the system and a bit less leakage of that nitrogen into water, into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide. So yeah, a win-win, which would be absolutely brilliant to be able to bring to farmers.
Which sounds pretty good. Will it be, because it's a bit special, will it need any special care?
Well, we don't really know, exactly how it's going to behave. Ryegrass is hanging out with clover and plantain and, chicory and a few other things in the pasture sometimes. So, it might change the dynamics there a bit. But we'll study that on the way through. And we know that, mixed sward pastures are how New Zealand does farming, and plants kind of settle in and work out how to cooperate with each other. So it might change that balance a bit, but we're not too worried about it. We think, again, the science we've seen so far tells us that it's a reasonably good prospect and unlikely to have any kind of fish hooks in it.
And you mentioned that it's also present in cropping plants and wheat. So is it possible that BNI could work somewhere else other than ryegrass?
Yeah, for sure. So, a number of cereals have been studied now, and a number of actually trees have shown this trait as well. And there's some tropical grass species that are showing it, and now we're seeing some temperate latitude grass species that are showing it. So yeah, it's something that can be deployed kind of throughout agriculture globally. It could really have some benefits, across the board, not just in pasture, but obviously in New Zealand and in AgResearch, we're incredibly passionate about pasture and pasture-based farming.
Thanks, Brent. That all sounds really exciting. So it looks very much like we don't have to stop farming or dramatically cut our stock numbers, and we can still reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's possible to keep farming and just do things a little bit differently. But that's the way Kiwi farmers have always done it. We've embraced change and found a way to innovate and stay ahead of the curve, which is going to be key to facing what's next. You've heard Suzanne talking about breeding for low methane livestock. If you'd like to test the animals on your farm with the AgPack trailer for sheep or the AgPack chambers for cattle, or find out more about breeding for this trait, visit agresearch.co.nz/podcast or click the link in the show notes.